All right, let's get started. So my name is Ben. You can find me on Twitter at Waptor75 or pentest.ben@gmail.com. If email is your thing, I don't promise I'll respond to you by email. This is raising the fruit. So you've heard the phrase, nothing is 100% secure. So instead of wasting time trying to make our systems unhackable, we need to focus on defense in depth, layering our defenses to frustrate attackers. Hackers are opportunists, and the vast majority of cyber attacks are done by automated scripts and bots that don't even require human effort. So your first line of defense says a lot about the security posture of your systems as a whole. If an opportunistic attacker sees an obvious weakness in your perimeter, even if it's minor, you've just gotten their attention. As a web app pen tester, I do adversary simulation against client websites and applications. So I'm paid to attack a client's perimeter using the same tools, techniques, and mindsets that malicious hackers use. I start my web app penetration test with Recon as I get familiar with the target. If during that initial phase I end up identifying a bunch of vulnerabilities before I start even properly looking for them, I'm going to start getting excited and I'll be a lot more motivated to dig deep looking for interesting findings. But if I've been poking around for a bit and it's apparent that the development team has things buttoned up really well, and I can already tell that I'm not going to find anything here, it's just I'm in for a real boring week of testing. And by the way, some colleagues of mine did a really good talk about this phenomenon at DerbyCon a few years ago. The QR code down below there will take you to their talk. Give it just a couple of seconds in case anyone wants to take a picture, and moving on. So these slides will be available also, so don't worry if I go a little too fast. We'll get there in a second. So the findings I noticed during Recon, I call it low-hanging fruit. I think most people call them low-hanging fruit. They're easily detected findings that are very easy to fix. When I see them, I can almost like start cold reading this application. Like, okay, the devs, they don't know how to write secure code. The app hasn't had a pen test before. I'm going to find a lot of interesting stuff by the time I'm finished. So I'm getting curious, how broken is this app really? So this can be too much of a good thing. When I've had a dozen low-risk findings that I need to put into a report after I'm done testing, I start to get grumpy, and not just because of my RSI. And then I got to do a readout call and take 45 minutes explaining to the dev team why they need to fix a bunch of issues that can't probably even be exploited to cause real harm to their customers. But still, nobody likes to get a report filled with things they need to address, especially if there's a go-live deadline coming up. So this report has 20 findings. This is a real report I did years ago. There's a critical, there's a high, there's 3 mediums, there's 11 lows, there's 4 infos. Look how many of these low-hanging fruit findings can be easily detected with free tools and minimal hacking experience and gotten rid of before we even start the pen test. So we both want the same thing. Help me help you. Let's work together to get rid of that low-hanging fruit and make everyone's day and week and after the week a lot easier. So I'll be spending a lot less time writing reports and a lot more time hacking. You'll get a cleaner report and you'll spend less time fixing issues, and you won't have to worry about randos calling you out on the bird site saying your website poses a grave existential risk to its users because you're missing HSTS and CSP response headers. To that end, I've created a big ass checklist, everything you need all in one place. So use that QR code to get a copy of this checklist as a Google Sheets file. That code also takes you to a copy of this very slide deck. I will leave this on the screen for approximately 10 seconds, and then we'll move on. And I don't actually have any more to say here, so I'm gonna sit in awkward silence for 5 seconds. All right, moving on. So what is it gonna take to make this happen? Honestly, just a handful of free tools. So before I go any further, I do want to address the fact there's a lot of tools out there that can do the same things that these tools do. If you want to use those instead, be my guest. These are just the ones that work the best for me. Burp Suite Community Edition is going to be the first and most relied on tool here. It is a Swiss Army chainsaw. At its heart, it's an intercepting proxy, but it can do a ton more. We'll use the free Community Edition, but if you want to go for the paid version, it's even more overpowered. The QR code right there takes you to their Getting Started guide, which is super helpful. What is an intercepting proxy? Think of it like a mail inspector who can open up any message and read it before sending it on to the recipient. But this mail inspector can also secretly change any part of those messages too. Kali Linux is a free Linux distro specifically made for pentesters. Now you can download and run it in a virtual machine. You can install it in the Windows subsystem for Linux, and I think there's like 5 other ways to install it as well. QR code takes you to get Kali. It's important to note that no scanner is 100% accurate. Getting a bunch of false positives in your scanner output is expected. It's part of the game, so it's up to you to make sure the stuff the scanner finds actually exists in your web app. Google is your friend, and also Stack Overflow. So we have 47 items in this checklist, and we have 25 minutes to get through them all. So we're going to do this like we're on the Gong Show. I'm going to blast through these vulnerabilities until I run out of time and they cut my feed. Once again, you can use that QR code to get a copy of both the Defender checklist you saw and the slide deck, and I'll be hanging out in the Discord server for the rest of the con. You can always just ping me on Twitter. So first off, we're going to use Nmap's simplest mode, where you point out a host and it detects all open ports. This is useful for discovering services that are exposed to the internet that very much should not be exposed to the internet. For example, you do not want to see remote desktop exposed to the internet ever. One cool thing about Nmap is its scripting engine, which turns port scanning tool into an everything scanning tool. And in this case, we're going to use the SSL enum cipher script to check on the TLS protocols and ciphers of the target. We only want to see modern TLS versions in use and strong encryption ciphers. Outdated or weak SSL or TLS protocols and weak ciphers generally going to be all low risk, unless you find things like null ciphers or real low low bit keys. So on the left, we see TLS 1.2 in use with strong ciphers, good. On the right, SSL v3 and TLS v1, outdated, not good. Weak desk ciphers, not good. That's only a couple of lows, but they're not hard to fix. And that'll get you rid of like 1 or 2 or maybe even 3, depending on how the tester is feeling that day findings. Nikto is another free open source automated tool. It is specifically a web app scanner. It's very good at finding basic vulnerabilities and interesting content. It's very good at calling out missing security headers, exposed admin interfaces, hidden content, directory listings, outdated software. Just make sure you verify that each finding actually exists. There are false positives. CMSeek or CMS-Seek is a free open source scanner focused on CMS frameworks. It'll fingerprint a CMS in use. Also what plugins are installed. It'll retrieve versions of everything it finds. It'll look for public vulnerabilities. It'll even try to harvest usernames for you. Once again, make sure to verify any vulnerabilities that it claims it finds. Finally, like I said, Burp Suite's free community edition is going to be the thing we'll use the most. We'll use it to crawl through our web app. So when you click a link in your browser, the browser is going to send a request to Burp instead of the web server. Burp will record that, and then it's going to send it on. Same with when it comes back. The request hits Burp Suite, Burp will record it and send it on to you. So you actually generate this proxy history. So you can always go back through everything you did and look back and see what the request and the response were, and it's super helpful. Now, the best thing Burp can do, though, is intercept that request and let you modify it before it sends it onto the server, which lets you bypass all sorts of client-side controls, from form length and type limitations to JavaScript input sanitization and more. It also nowadays includes a Chromium browser with it, just bundled along with it. You don't need to mess with proxies and proxy chains and anything like that in the English language. Doesn't contain words that can describe just how helpful this is to a pen tester to have a built-in Chromium browser. So you launch your browser, navigate through your apps, sign in, click the links, add content, change content, log out, log in, go through the whole day in the life of a typical user. So everything gets recorded for you, and that's going to be our main tool for the rest of the talk. So right off the bat, just going to put this out there. In the year of our Lord, 2021, there's absolutely no excuse for a live application on the internet not to use HTTPS and TLS to encrypt network traffic. Back in '98, you can complain that it slows down your site, but these days we don't use 56K modems to surf the information superhighway anymore. Even if you're not submitting sensitive information, enable TLS anyway. There's plenty of free options out there. Pick one and go with it. If I see a website without HTTPS, that's going to be a medium risk or even a high risk, depending on what I find in it. HSTS is a server response header sent to your browser when you first access a site. It tells a browser that it should remember the site should only be accessed using HTTPS, which makes it harder to get tricked into accessing the unencrypted version. So if you're using HTTPS like you're supposed to, it's a good idea to put HSTS header in there as well. By default, many frameworks and web servers are configured to disclose their backend and server types and versions in the response headers. And that's not a vulnerability on its own, but it tells an attacker more than they need to know. If you're running out-of-date software, well, A, you shouldn't be. And B, you don't want to tell everyone who visits your site that you're running out-of-date software. Just get rid of the headers or change them to something cheeky if that's your thing. Autocomplete, not a big deal these days. The problem is that a browser could store your credentials unencrypted if you didn't explicitly set autocomplete equals off in the HTML element of your login form or your password field, which if someone gets a hold of your computer, then they can export those passwords. But nowadays, that's kind of normal functionality because all the browsers have password managers anyway. So this, when you see it in your report, it's because someone wanted to pad their report with additional findings. If you just set autocomplete equals off, they won't be able to do that to you. When an application returns different messages to a user who tries to log in with an existing and a non-existent username, they can brute force the login page to harvest valid usernames just by saying, okay, I sent bob@bob.com, that gave me an invalid. Okay, I sent, Ben, whatever, that one says that one did let me in, whereas it says the user didn't exist for the previous one. Okay, we're just gonna start building a table. So the easiest way to fix this is just use a generic error message. Sorry, username and password you entered is incorrect. Users hate that, but hackers hate it more. Occasionally, you'll find a web app that does weird transforms on user passwords before they're compared to credentials on file. This can create a case where you can log in with both an uppercase and lowercase version of your password, even if you have some characters missing at the end of your password, it might still let you in. These are the things that make pen testers start wondering what other weird password things are happening behind the scenes. Are you guys actually storing passwords instead of just the hashes? Are the passwords being stored truncated? Like, what's this? I need to dig further. This should never, ever happen. This finding here is my magic pie bush. One of my first pen tests I ever did is for a US federal government e-commerce web app. I was able to log in with any existing username as long as I put an asterisk in the password field. I've never seen this issue again, but I will closely inspect every application I see in here until the end of time. Logging in with wildcard characters instead of a password is an indication that something's horribly wrong with the authentication mechanism. So if you're going to be trying any of these password shenanigans, just remember to get an invalid login, okay, once, twice maybe, and then log in with your correct password so you don't lock yourself out and have to get a hold of the client and have them unlock you. If you see an HTTP 200 response to a successful login, the browser might actually be caching that request and your credentials along with it. Those are getting stored in plain text, so anyone who has access to that server can harvest those credentials. Return a 302 and redirect the user to their correct page, and you won't have that issue. When a user logs in with HTTP GET instead of POST, those creds are passing the URL query string instead of the post body where they're supposed to go. So if you have HTTPS enabled, those query string parameters are encrypted. If not, that's going to raise the risk of this finding. But the usual danger here is that the receiving server might be storing plain text URLs in a log file. So those credentials could be recovered. Or if there's like you're behind a corporate HTTPS proxy, the proxy might also be storing that stuff unencrypted as well. So it's not the end of the world if an application is transmitting credentials over basic auth, if it's also using HTTPS. Are you seeing a pattern here? There's also, even if it is though, there's still a number of reasons why basic auth is less secure and therefore will get called out if you're using that instead of forms-based. For one, the credentials are base 64 encoded, which is not human readable, but it's trivial to convert it to plain text. The password is sent repeatedly for each request, which makes a larger attack window. The password is cached or stored permanently by the browser. There's no way to really log out of the application or to lock a user out. There are ways, but there's no easy way to do it like there is with forms-based. And once again, if you're behind a corporate proxy, it might store your credentials. Cookie options. The secure cookie flag tells the browser not to send cookies over an insecure non-HTTPS connection. Like if you remember back in 2010, Facebook required users to log in over HTTPS, but it allowed cookies to be sent unencrypted. So if you use the Firesheep browser plugin while on shared Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or a cafe, you could just hijack someone's Facebook session just by sniffing the unencrypted cookies. Setting secure on a cookie will avoid that. HTTP only cookie tells your browser not to send cookies over any protocol other than HTTP. So if you have a user who falls victim to a cross-site scripting attack on your web page, the attacker might be able to pull their session ID using JavaScript. If you have HTTP only set, that prevents that. So it's kind of defense in depth against cross-site scripting. But regardless of cookie flags, you don't ever want to see sensitive data in cookies. Don't ever put sensitive data in cookies. Just don't. Session trapping and session fixation are real easy to mix up. And I've worked at places that use them interchangeably, but here's how I understand them. With session trapping, when you first browse to a login page, sometimes you'll get a session ID placed in your browser before you're authenticated. When you log in, that session ID is supposed to change, so you're not using the same cookie value you had when you were unauthenticated. If it doesn't change, there's a danger an attacker doing like a kiosk attack or something where they can go to a public machine, browse to your site, and then leave and just wait after they made a note of the cookie they got. Then someone walks in, walks up to the kiosk, they'll log in to the site. That password, or sorry, that cookie value doesn't get changed, and you know what it is, so you can go ahead and hijack their session. Session fixation allows you to actively change the session ID to an arbitrary value, which isn't a huge problem by itself. But if you have both session fixation and session trapping on your web page, then you've got a real fun phishing attack. So like, let's say you want to take advantage of that combo on a home banking site. You visit the site, get your session ID assigned to your browser before you logged in. Make a note of that ID, and then send an email to a customer saying like, sign up for our bank's iPhone giveaway, and send them a link saying, you know, a question mark, session ID equals whatever the ID is. Because it's vulnerable to both those things, it's going to assign the victim the session ID you specified. And now you know the session ID they're using because you gave it to them. Logging a user out of a web app is a two-step process. Step one, invalidate the session ID on the user's browser, usually by deleting the cookie or by setting a new session cookie in their browser. Step two is to get rid of it on the server as well. A surprising number of websites forget that second part. The server still considers the old session to be active even after a logout, which is great for me if I'm an attacker who hijacks someone's session because I'm still logged in even after they log out. So story time here. I once worked at a place where I tested a very large bank's home banking website. And as part of my testing, I made sure that when I clicked logout, I couldn't reuse my old session cookies. They did indeed nuke the value on the server end too. About 10 months later, some independent security researcher posted a YouTube video claiming, here's how you can log into your home banking account without your password. What he did is he saved a session cookie and logged out. Then he put that session cookie back in his browser later. And now you can log in without your password. So the bank got real mad about this and demanded to know how we missed it in our testing. So I ended up having to show my supervisor and his supervisor my Burp Suite proxy logs that I saved. Remember when I said Burp saves all the requests and responses? That turns out it's a lifesaver because I could prove that it did indeed not have that problem when I tested it, because turns out a few months after I tested it, they pushed an update that broke the log out. So it shows you a few things. When researchers exaggerate security risk, it makes everyone's jobs harder. Two, even low risk vulnerabilities can have a pretty big impact. And three, always save your Burp Suite logs as long as you can. Clickjacking is a nasty little vulnerability. So let's say, here's a good scenario for you. You visit an evil web page that tells you you want a new iPhone, but you need to click a link to accept it. But unknown to you, the web page used an invisible iframe to load up twitter.com over the page you're actually seeing. And because you're logged into Twitter on another tab, you're logged into Twitter. So the evil site is going to align that Twitter iframe in such a way that when you go to click Get My iPhone, you're actually clicking an invisible retweet button on something you don't want to be retweeting. But this is easy to detect. If the site isn't setting content security policy or an X-frame options header in the responses, use clickjacker.io linked there to see if it's vulnerable. Concurrent user sessions is an informational finding that's only good for padding empty pentest reports. There, I said it. Most web apps allow concurrent sessions by design, and getting rid of that will just annoy most users, except in very, very specific scenarios. This is just a non-issue. You remember we talked about session hijacking like 4 times? Timeouts are another defense in depth measure that should always be implemented because they help narrow an attacker's window of opportunity. So it's a bit of a judgment call on the tester's part to determine what excessive session timeout is. I usually go with 20 minutes if I can sign in, then walk away for 21 minutes. I want to see my session's been terminated automatically by the time I get back. If you have a password change option for logged in users, you should check several things because there's a few ways to screw that up. The first is if you're expected to log in with a password, you absolutely need a way to change that password later. Second, if a user changes their password, they absolutely need to supply their current password to do it. This keeps session hijacking and CSRF attacks from doing complete count takeovers the easy way. You should never, ever be able to change someone else's password. It seems like a silly thing to say, but I've seen applications that let you do that. The password change form sends the requesting user's username and new password to the server. So when you see those passwords in Burp Suite, you can't not screw with it. What happens if I just replace my username with someone else's? The answer may surprise you. When checking the strength of an app's password policy, I always start with the easiest password, a lowercase letter a. If they let me do that, okay, that's an automatic hi. I'm done. Time to find the next finding. Otherwise, I'll increase the complexity, see what the app lets me get away with. How about the word password? How about my username? Or like 8 lowercase a characters in a row. Obviously, go through these checks at account creation time if you can provision your own account, but then check them again after you log in and attempt to change your password. When there's multiple areas where you can change your passwords, sometimes one of them will let you bypass the password complexity rules that the other ones will enforce. According to NIST, all security questions and password hints that are available to unauthenticated users are considered weak. But if you absolutely have to use them, for the love of God, do not use things like what is your favorite color or what high school did you attend or anything easily guessable, brute forceable, or discovered within literally 90 seconds of Googling somebody. When you visit a page that contains sensitive information, check the server response headers. You're going to want to see the cache control, the pragma, and expires all set in order to get as much coverage across as many browsers as possible. Some browsers don't respect some of those, some browsers will. If you set all 3, you should be covering all your bases. If you're testing an IIS app, there's a bunch of ways that someone might be doing a view state wrong. First and foremost, always make sure it's encrypted. Burp Suite will decode a view state into a human readable form, but it won't if it's encrypted. So that's an easy way to find out. If the view state's unencrypted and has sensitive information, or the MAC is not enabled, that finding risk goes up. You'll need 2 users for vertical privilege escalation, a high privileged admin, a low privileged regular user, something like that, where you have one with more privileges than the other. Log in with the high privilege user and go to a page that only they are allowed to visit or interact with, like maybe a administer users page or something. Note the URL or the request used to make it and log out. Now try to get back to that page with the low privilege user and see if it'll let you. Horizontal privilege escalation, you also need 2 users, but you need 2 users of the same permission levels. Log in as user number 1, go to a page that contains information only they can see, like user settings or a user profile that contains sensitive information. Then note the request used to reach the page and log out and try it again with user number 2 and see if they can see that stuff too. CSRF stands for client-side request forgery, and it's a little complex to describe, so we'll go over the simplest form. An attacker sends a victim a link that contains actions for the victim to take in the URL query string. If a victim is logged into a targeted web app and clicks the link, the browser will send those URL parameters to the web server, and the server will happily execute those actions on behalf of the logged in victim. So the way to fix this is send a secret string with any request that changes data on the server. That's called a CSRF token or a nonce. That string's compared to an expected value on server. If they match, then we can safely assume the request is genuine. Usually that token will be helpfully labeled, so you can see it pretty easily in Burp's proxy history as such. Excuse me. If you don't see that token being sent, that's a finding. If you can remove that token and still make the request and it works, that's a worse finding. So one more story break for you here. I got about 7 minutes. So the website popversussoda.com is a crowdsourced map that shows the distribution of people across the US who use different words when referring to carbonated soft drinks. In general, Midwesterners say pop, people on the coast and I guess Missouri say soda, and the Southerners think it's acceptable to say Coke, regardless of the brand of soft drink they're drinking. If you call it something else where you live, the site asks you to specify the word you use along with your location, and it'll add that to its map and statistics. So take a look at how my response is sent to the server. The app puts each answer I give into a URL query string separated by a colon character. So you can easily see how my answers are transmitted in the URL query string up there. And what you're not seeing here is an anti-CSRF token parameter, meaning this is vulnerable to the world's most useless CSRF attack. So back when I worked at Spider Labs, one of my coworkers, he sent this link to the team chat, telling our colleagues to look at this fun map he found. When people clicked the link, they unwittingly sent those parameters to the server, resulting in the database suddenly recording 13 people from Grand Rapids, Michigan who say sody pap. So this is kind of related to what we saw in the previous chapter, where we want to see a 302 response to a login request instead of 200. We also want to see that with all sensitive information, like credit card transactions or something with your social security number or anything that's sensitive. And similar to the logging in chapter, where we look for username enumeration on the login page, check the forgot password feature and see if you can enumerate users that way too, because maybe they'll fix one and not the other. The password reset DOS is fun. So if you can force an immediate password reset by giving the application a username or an email address, you can basically just lock someone out of the web app by just constantly making those requests. Either rate limit stuff or use a CAPTCHA, or better yet, send a reset password link to the user and let the user themselves do the reset instead of, someone just making the reset from the web page. The bypass, this one's rare but really fun when you find it, especially multi-step password reset schemes, because it's hard to keep track of the reset state. Once I saw a coworker come up with a way to change any user's password to something of his choosing by exploiting a 3-step forgot password process. Step 1, asked for your email address, and then took you to step 2, where asked you security questions. You get those right, you go to step 3, where you can submit your new password. So he completed step 1 by entering another user's email address, but then he got stuck on step 2 because he didn't know the security questions. So he looked up at the URL and saw it ended in /step2.jsp. So he changed it to step3.jsp, and the application took him to the page that let him put in a new password. Because it already saved the email address from step 1, he could change anybody's password with that. Web apps should never store passwords in the database, even encrypted passwords. Only the hashes of passwords should be stored and compared to hashed user input. That is, hash the password the user sends you at login, see if it matches a hash on a file. If a web app sends you your current password, that means it's storing your actual password in the database and not just a hash, and that's very, very bad. After a successful password reset, users should not get a new password sent to them because commonly used channels for that, like SMS or email, they're not encrypted. And passwords aren't things you want to see transmitted in plain text. And worse, the user probably won't delete the message that contains that new password, so anyone with access to the device or account can retrieve them. Now, that's bad enough, but it's even worse if that password isn't actually temporary. If you get a new password sent to you and the app doesn't force you to change it after you log in, that's even worse. So, as I mentioned earlier, CMSeek and Nikto, they're good at discovering these publicly exposed admin interfaces, but you can also do it manually. Like if you just append /sitemap.xml to the website's domain, like starbucks.com/sitemap.xml, you can look for any admin panels that way. Or even just going through the UI, you might see a link that says admin. Just click it, see if you can see it. These, like, in the ideal world, they should be like allow listed, so only legitimate admins can even see the link and not all users. If you do see an admin login page, make sure to check all the usual login and forgot password stuff against them too, because sometimes if they lock down the regular login page, the admin login page won't have those protections either. So maybe you'll get some findings there too. Going live with default credentials still active is one of the silliest ways to get your web app wrecked by attackers. So from a pentester's point of view, default creds are the best way to get a critical risk finding while doing the least amount of work possible. So it's always worth it to try to log in with default creds. With CAPTCHAs, it's hard to write your own. There's free CAPTCHAs out there. They're very effective. That doesn't stop people from trying. I've seen homebrew CAPTCHAs that include the correct answer in the server response, which completely misses the point. If you're testing a homebrew CAPTCHA, check the server response to see if you see interesting stuff, or use inspect element, or look at the HTML source to see if the solution's there. Or depending on how broken the implementation is, you might even be able to get the thing to serve you a challenge you already know the answer to. So the eCart test file is a 68-byte string of characters that's designed to test AV products. Virtually all antivirus will treat this as a real virus and remove or quarantine any document that starts with this string and is not larger than 128 bytes. So you can easily test if a file upload does virus scanning by saving this string to a text file and uploading it. If you can re-download it later, you get a nice screenshot of your AV's malware alert pop up to go with your finding. If other users can download the infected file, then you can upgrade the risk. When looking through your burp suite proxy history, keep an eye out for requests transmitting get or post parameters that reference a number or an ID. If you can resend those requests, but with that number incremented up or down, you might be able to that might get you served things you're not supposed to have access to. Verbose errors are not usually a finding on their own, or a vulnerability on their own rather, but they can give attackers information that they can use to refine their other attacks against a website. So always use vague, generic error messages that don't give away too much information. There's no reason to display a stack trace to a user in an error message. Just a simple, sorry, an error occurred, try again, or contact support is all you need. And once we're done with our testing, we're going to test out the application's lockout policy. And unless you can easily unlock your own user, save this step for last. Try to log in 10 times with the incorrect password, and then try to log in with the right password the 11th time. If you're logged in, that's a finding. And we made it through under 30 minutes. So I guess to recap here, this is a way for defenders to go through and basically play Pentester and get rid of a lot of these little findings before the actual Pentesters do and start generating those large reports. And actually, I'm going to scroll back up to that QR code. There's so many slides in this presentation, you guys. There it is.